It's an honor, it's a pleasure to have the school for several days, especially for those who are into specialization in cinematography. One, I may say so, one of the world's leading, even legendary cinematographers, Ed Lachman, who sent you his intense bio and filmography, so no need to repeat it. And Ed is here willingly. It's his first time in Israel. You will meet later this week also professionals in Tel Aviv. Shar, can we have some air condition? Or am I wrong? It's working. Is willing to be here and to give whatever he can. Your questions here and later on the set. He will work with students from his life experience and his way, which is a unique way, relatively also to world top cinematographers. And to sum it, I hope in the briefest way, it's to work in the independent American film world less than in Hollywood, to work not only in the States but in Europe, and more than that, to form a long-time relations with different and various directors in the States and in Europe or in the world who are of interest to him by their themes, by their methods, by their personalities, by their style, and to work with them in partnership. To work with them in a quest, in partnership. So when we see the outcome, we see that it was a unique work of a director and a cinematographer, unique for itself and different than the other works of the director and of the cinematographer. It's definitely, as usual, takes two for a tango, also in this field, between cinematographers and directors, and the urge to search for new themes and for new styles. And the background of Ed coming from stills did allow him, amongst other things, to be in the midst of the search, as well as his feel and work in the experimental field of filmmaking. So, it's a pleasure, it's an honor.
Thank you.
Guy who's a graduate and a teacher will lead the discussion with you.
Yeah.
Want to say something? Check that it's working.
Testing. Well, I never intended to be a cinematographer. I went to art school, I studied painting, and I took a course at Harvard at like appreciation in film. And I realized that images got on the screen for a reason. They didn't just happen. And I guess that's why I always approach film hopefully from a painterly style, in the sense that painters always approach their work from either a social, political, or a style that they have a personal connection to. And so that's why I guess I gravitated towards filmmakers that wanted to find their own language and wanted to explore how one tells stories with images. And I think that's what's important. You know, it's important to learn the technical aspects of filmmaking, which we all have to learn to be able to use that language, but we also have to understand how we see things and why we see things, and how that implements how you tell stories, and why each story can be told differently. You know, why is the language of cinema images? It's not the written word. I mean, the written word is there that's what makes filmmaking unique, is the language that we tell our stories in. Else, you know, we could tell them on a stage, or we could tell them in a book. I mean, one example I use is in a book, or it takes paragraphs or many sentences to explain place, where you are. But you can enter the interior world of the character in a sentence and say how they think or feel. Well, in film you have just the opposite problem, where you can show place, location in one shot, but it's much harder to show the interior world of the character. And I guess that's what I'm always searching for with a director, is how you tell the interior world of the character, how you find the language to encapsulate the world for that character and have the audience experience that world. And this film, you know, I sat through part of it, and there was a normal reaction. You know, people laughed and chuckled and had a good time with it. And it's partly, you know, what Todd was approaching, the director, was using Douglas Sirk. He was a director that came from Germany at the end of the, well, just at the beginning of the Nazi period. He was like one of the last directors to be able to leave. He was actually Danish, he wasn't German. I forget his exact name in Danish, but it became Sirk when he came to the United States. And you know, people like von Stroheim and Lang, they were all here, and they all knew each other. But he worked in the Brechtian Theater in Berlin. He worked in, he was a well-known theater director, and he had done films. And he was actually a very successful director, and he was actually asked to stay. And actually, a sad footnote was his son stayed behind and became a poster boy for the Nazi cinema, and was later killed on the Russian front. But so when he came to the United States, he couldn't find work because he was seen as being German, and he actually had a chicken farm, and he said it was some of the more pleasant time of his stay in the United States. And he became a script doctor. And this form, they were called weepies, which now we would call soap operas, was very popular at this period, and they were made very fast. They were shot in like 18 days, backlot, you know, studios like Universal. And he got a chance, a break, to make one of these films. And but what he did was he used, these films were shot very brightly lit, like, you know, people think comedies should be. But he started to employ techniques of what we consider film noir, where he used very strong lighting and abstraction in his colors. And he used social and political statements about the values of middle-class American life, that he was one of the first people really to like imbue like a popular form of cinema and imbue it with, you know, social and political questions about gender, and well, not so much about gender, it was there, but he couldn't explicitly talk about it, but certainly about race in a film like Imitation of Life. So the kind of what was interesting, what Todd tried to explore in this film was use the technique of the 50s, in where you reach a person's emotions through artifice, through the artificial techniques of color, and you know that this isn't a representation of a realistic world, but we're manufacturing this world. And also in the way he used his camera. His camera is always used kind of in imprisoning the characters. You see characters in scenes through doorways, windows, from outside. It takes kind of an objective viewpoint, but it also takes a viewpoint that imprisons these characters. And so part of the technique was like, could we reach an audience in 2004 the same way that Sirk reached his audience then? And Todd had done a film called With Dolls about Karen Carpenter, superstar. And eventually people kind of break down their distance, like, and are affected by it emotionally. And I know this is a very American kind of thematic and story, but it was interesting to see people respond to this subject matter. In 2004, about race and gender, in a way that, you know, in the 50s were still taboos, that people you would think would be a little more sophisticated about this, but we're obviously not. And one thing I wanted to read was something that Todd wrote, like a page, about, and this is another thing about Todd, he researches his material extremely densely and brings a lot of different visual references and ideas. But what he wrote about Sirk, and also this filmmaker, Douglas Sirk, was an important influence on Fassbinder. Fassbinder spoke greatly about him, and a lot of Fassbinder's work you could see in a Sirkian context, where his dialogue, even though I don't speak German, had an artifice to it, and his camera movement had an artifice to it. So maybe I'll just read a part of that, how Todd explained what he was approaching. The 50s melodrama of Douglas Sirk and Max Ophüls has always astounded me. The titles alone, All That Heaven Allowed, Reckless Moment, Written on the Wind, Imitation Life, suggest a cinema of sweeping arpeggios and transcend artifice, which of course they deliver. But beneath the lush and teeming surfaces are claustrophobic stories of disillusionment and resignation, of women locked in houses who emerge in the end as lesser human beings, for all they surrender to the ways of the world. The subjects of melodrama are never up to the demands made on their lives. Small towns' notions of dignity always win out over desire. So that's kind of was our approach. So I guess this week I want to show a range of styles. This certainly is the more embellished and stylistic kind of look. And later in the week I want to show import-export, a film I work with Ulrich Seidl, an Austrian filmmaker, in which he uses naturalism. And so the important thing isn't really what style you work in, but how you work in the style you work in, and how you find your vision in language of the images. Do you have any specific questions? And maybe we can take off from there.
Have a question? I wanted to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a lot about Todd Haynes, but let's talk about your work in this film. How did you approach this when he came to you with the idea of making this? When he came to you with the idea of making this look, this Douglas Sirk look, how did you approach this?
Well,
what I wanted to know is, did you work in the same limitations that Douglas Sirk had in the 50s?
Yeah, I mean, let's say the camera movement, the way the scenes are covered. I mentioned he shot these films very quickly. They were like 18-day shoots in the back lot. So I realized looking at the films, they were always moving masters. The camera's always moving with the characters, and or not. Sometimes the camera's unmotivated, which is also a Sirkian style, where you're sweeping crane shots and dolly moves. And then he would just punch in for the medium close-ups. But you never really had the language of cinema today, where you have, extreme close-ups, or a lot of the coverage was done from the point of view of where the camera ended up on the dolly shot from the master. So we were true to that. And then I also realized the lens that he probably used was a 32 or 40. So we never used longer lenses. Longer lenses really came in, I think, more when, you know, cinematographers worked in commercials. And so, you know, you're trying to grab people's attention on the small TV screen with longer lenses. So they really, long lenses really came in the 50s and 60s. So we never really used any long lenses. I would say maybe a 40 or 50 was the longest lens we ever used, even in the over shots. And that was the other thing. In all the frames, there's always somebody else in the frame, or it's framed by the architecture. Only at the end scene where she's having the dialogue with Raymond, and the camera moves off Raymond, and she's left in a close-up. That was the one place that we decided that emotionally it was correct to isolate her. But up until then, she's always surrounded by, or, you know, she's isolated in her loneliness by the geography of the world that she's encapsulated in. Did that answer?
Yeah, part of it, but also, can you talk a bit about the lighting?
Oh.
And did you use any digital effects, or were you totally true to the film?
Yeah. We made a decision at this time, you know, this 2004, people were starting to use digital correction and digital IPs, you know, to finish the film. And we made a decision not to. We made a decision that Cirque at that time, and his cinematographer was Russell Meddy, who we always worked with, worked in film, so we finished it in film. And I'm actually surprised looking at it, you know, even now, that you know, you don't go in and, like, you know, block out one window or a wall for, you know, that we were true to that. And also all the opticals in the film are film opticals, and so they're not perfect, and he wanted that. He wanted kind of the imperfection of what they had to work with. And so also the exterior lighting, wherever I did partly use it, I used tungsten lights and gelled it the way they would have, and not HMI. So again, I was trying to implement the feeling of way. I also used the older Cooke speed Pancro lenses that I have a set of, and not the modern lenses. So I did everything I could possibly. I didn't have the same film stock, but I did everything possible to create the world for me of what their limitations were in their lighting. And I also maybe am going to be able to show you Mildred Pierce. This is another period drama with Kate Winslet that was done in black and white, and it was a, you know, very successful film in the 40s. And we did it in color, but there I had the opposite problem. Here, I was on many locations. Now the house here was a set, but all the other locations are real locations. So my problem there was how do I create real locations and make them feel like a set? Even the driving scenes we did in rear screen projection. So we wanted the audience to feel the artifice, to feel the manufactured world, so to speak, to create this, you know, abstraction in for them. And you know, the acting is mannered, the clothes, you know, everything kind of works together, you know, in a work, and that's what we were attempting to do. With gels, I've always worked with gels, either with color temperature, you know, how you play with daylight, or fluorescent with tungsten film, and I did the same thing I normally do. Early on in my work, I did a film called Union City, and that was a 50s film. Debbie Harry was in it, and I experimented then with gels, and I've always worked, and it's partly, I guess, understanding or working with color, you know, the way you use color, not not like a pictorial way, but more using color for psychological. So like the nights in this film, the early nights are done with a periwinkle kind of blue-purple. And as the relationship disintegrates, I go towards a more cyan blue-green for the night. Now all these things, you know, you do with the director, with the art director. It's very important to me when I work is the relationship I have with the art director, because it's what I'm putting in front of the cameras is as important as what I'm doing. And so I do a lot of tests with the colors in the set and the wardrobe to see how they're going to respond to the film stock. And I guess that's... Yeah, so we did tests with the gels against the colors in the set. And I use, generally I work with two colors, like a warm color and a cool color, because one advances, one recedes, and that gives you kind of depth and separation in the scene. So I strongly worked with that in this. And I kind of came up with my own gel patterns in different scenes and had discussions with them about it.
Somebody want to ask a question about Far From Heaven?
Maybe I could say, like the difference, let's say like Raymond, the gardener. So the idea there was I put him in what I consider primary colors, natural colors. So oranges, greens, browns, yellows, things that you would find in nature. And then where we're dealing with the husband, Frank, where he goes, let's say, to the gay bar, that's seen as an aberration, it's seen as, so I used colors there that were secondary colors that would, were more acidic. And so I used like a yellow-green against magenta. They're not really primary colors. And so I don't know if it affects the audience, but in my mind it was a way of creating an abstraction to his world that wasn't natural or wholesome, the way it would have been seen.
Do you have questions?
What considerations, if any, did you have for the skin tone of the actors? Julianne Moore being very white and Raymond being black.
Black. Yeah, that's always a problem, you know, when you have very diverging skin tones. And usually people worry about the black skin tone, so they overlight the set, and then the white person goes too bright. So I always prefer to go the other way. I rather the black person goes too dark, because we know he's dark anyway. So I'd rather, you know, than screw up the scene that way. Actually, that last scene at night, I was like, oh my, I kept putting light in and in and in, trying to, you know, because I hate, even in a film like this, where I use theatrical lighting, which we didn't really talk about. The lighting in this film isn't naturalistic. And when you look at certain films, studio films, it's studio lighting, where they're lighting from up above on the set. It isn't necessarily where the light's coming in the windows, which, you know, is where we light now, or big sources. They were lighting smaller sources in different areas. So I tried to do that, light smaller sources and have people walk in and out of the light, which is more the way they did it back then. They would use harder light, not bounce light. So I tried to do that. So I tried to implement this style, because styles change photographically, because lenses change, film stock changes. I know now we're in the digital world, which, you know, I guess we'll get into a discussion about, but I'm still kind of stuck in the film world, so I can talk about things from the film world, but I think that you can apply what you understand in the film world to the digital world to understand what you're doing with the digital world. Like my gaffer kind of laughed at me. I've done 2 digital films, Life During Wartime with Todd Solondz, and A Prairie Home Companion with Robert Altman, and I'd bring my spot meter to the set, because that's the way I like my interiors, with a spot meter to figure out the contrast and the ratio of the light. And he'd say, what do you got that for? You know, just look at the monitor. But I wanted to be consistent and understand how the digital media saw the light in contrast and exposure. And I mean, slowly I started to put it away, but it was very helpful for me to understand what what the range I was working with. And then also, you're not at the dictation of the DI, the digital technician, who can change things on you every day. I wanted him to be consistent every day in what he did, and I would make the change. It was kind of like the way you use printer lights. Printer lights in film was a way of understanding exposure and color. So let's say, well, the average was, let's say 30 across, RGB, 30, 30, 30. And then that affects the exposure. So, if your numbers were very low in the low 20s, you would underexpose, and if they were very high, you were overexposing. But each of those ways of exposing changes the look of the film. And I wanted to understand that in the digital world. So I know we're going to work together, with a digital camera, and I brought my spot meter. So maybe we could just try to analyze. There's another interesting in what I tried to do with the red camera on this one shoot was, they have that thing called false color, or where you can judge exposure by the colors that they show you, green, yellow, red. So I tried to figure out, unfortunately I didn't bring it, what exposure was in those colors. Let's say green was 18% gray and red was 3 stops over. So I tried to figure out, and then I could, for my head, I could figure out where I was with the digital chip. So, but that's part of our jobs. I mean, there are people here that aren't just cinematographers, right? So I don't know how technical we get, but a part of our job is understanding the range of the negative of what you're doing. Like when you're seeing shadow detail in those scenes, I know I'm like 2.5, 3.5 stops down, and I'm going to print it down another stop. But I'm still reading information in the shadow areas. But my highlights aren't burning out. My highlights are holding. They're down half a stop to a stop. I always know what guys are doing if they're doing it at night, because night, you really have to understand the range of what your negative is. So your highlights aren't just burning out, just because you go for the shadow detail. Sometimes you control it. It's harder when you're shooting in a real location, but then you work off of the light that's there.
More questions about Far From Heaven? So maybe let's go to the beginning. How did you become a cinematographer?
Oh, well, how do I get to this? Well, I made little films, and then I realized, because it was an expensive medium, that I could shoot for other people and learn how to make films through the experience of doing it, and also learning through other people's success or mistakes. So the little films I made were kind of like portrait films, somewhat documentary in style. And so then people asked me to shoot for them, and then I realized, I could actually make a profession of shooting. And so, but I always did that to supplement my own work. And so I kind of inadvertently became a cameraman that way.
But you start off from painting, is that right?
Yeah, I started off by studying painting and art history, and that was really my background. you know, the way I talk about technique was just kind of the way I figured things out. I did go to film school, but the film schools I went to weren't necessarily, you know, just for technique or technical. It was more like film appreciation. In fact, I wanted to mention 3 books that have been influential for me. One recently reading. One is, and I saw in your library that you have a collection of his films here, is Joris Evens' film Camera and I. That was like the first first book that got me interested in the idea of what cinematography was. And my background also started out with the Maisel brothers in documentary, and I can say I learned a lot about framing and the immediacy of the moment and lighting by what exists in reality. I mean, you know, here we are, and we're lit overhead with these numerous lights overhead. I don't think I could light this any better than the way it is now. So, you know, reality or the environment that we live in, we have to be keen observers. So his book was wonderful because here was someone in the 40s starting out to make, you know, political and social documentaries. He was very leftist. He filmed at the Spanish, war and China and whatever. But he was revolutionary in the way that he thought about imagery of what really existed and not like recreating it, like the John Grierson school of like somewhat recreating scenes and manufacture. He believed that you could find reality and you had to work with reality to show the truth of what the image was. And so, you know, today we take that for granted and we do it in our narrative filmmaking, but at the time it was very important. So that book, The Camera and I, and then Antonioni wrote a short book called The Bowling Alley on the River Tiber. And it's unrealized screenplays, but he also talks about images, and it's quite compelling. He talks about how we falsify the world through our visual cliches of commercial cinema, you know, and how we're falsifying the world through our images, and that's quite interesting. And then this recent book, I met this filmmaker only a year ago, and he was signing his book, and I actually brought it. He's an experimental filmmaker. His name is Nathaniel, I'll say it right, Dorsky, Nathaniel Dorsky. And this book is called Devotional Cinema, and you should get it, because the way he talks about filmmaking and images is a revelation. He compares it to actually almost a transformation, a religious experience. And I wish I could say some of the things he says in the book, but I'll give you a couple things I remember. He's really searching for the nature of why we create images and what images really represent. And one of his ideas or references is, in the Middle Ages, the cathedral, one saw the world through our personal, our personal viewpoint of the world was through self. And even the idea of stained glass windows was a way of them not seeing out, but seeing in. That the world that they created on the stained glass was a glorification of the individual's stance in the world. That they were the center of the universe. And then his point is, when the Renaissance came, the windows became clear. And the windows were more about the point of view of what we see outside of ourselves. And that the Renaissance was more embracing a viewpoint of the world outside. And then what he tries to make the point about is cinema really has to be both things. Cinema has to be a personal viewpoint, but we have to be open to what we see outside. And I see that in a lot of filmmakers, where some filmmakers are egocentric to their own viewpoint, but really miss what life is outside of them. And other filmmakers don't make a statement about what life is from within and only see it from outside. And I think as all of us as image makers have to find that balance of what images represent and what we want to translate in our images. Because I think images are a certain kind of poetry, and that, you know, we get hung up, or people get hung up with the idea that images are representational of a world that we live in, but really it's an illusion. It's also an illusion what we live in, but it's certainly an illusion of what we create. Even in a documentary sense, we're manufacturing a world to make people believe that that's real. So I think once you take the stance that you can move on and not just see the world as what we think it represents, but see what's hidden behind the documentary image, then we become storytellers. Was that confusing? All right.
So maybe we'll move to see a film.
Oh, another one. All right. Like,
Part of maybe we'll start off with Wim Wenders, Tokyo.
All right.
Documentary.
sure. I haven't seen that in a while. This film, Tokyo, got Wim and Werner Herzog and Helma Sanders were invited to Japan for a week. It was like an exchange between German culture and Japan. And Wim decided he would take me along, and it was just Wim and myself. And we just shot images. And he also was referencing Ozu, who he, reveres, who was like the father of Japanese cinema. And so we really didn't know what we were shooting. We just went out and shot the way Wim shoots, kind of like, I call him a librarian of images. We just went out and shot images, things that he responded to. And then also we interviewed his cinematographer, Ryu, and we interviewed his actor, who's kind of like the father figure of his films. So there was some connection to Ozu, but it was kind of to look at Japan from how Japan had changed from Ozu's. Ozu always was really talking about in his films the Americanization and the loss of the family and the values of traditional Japanese culture after the war. And so here we were, I guess, I don't remember, we made it like 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Here we were in the 20th century, late 20th century, looking at what images were like in Japan today. And he took a long time to edit this film. He was in the middle of like another film, and I didn't think anything would happen of it. And then I just found it for a long time, I always thought this was my best work. Because it was just me with a camera, I even loaded my own film, and him doing sound. And it was just kind of like, he started doing diary films after this. But somehow I think this is the best one.
Okay, and the scene we're going to see is the interview with Ozu's cameraman,
Oh, all right.
cinematographer.
Yeah. So we did an interview with him, and then we could talk. I could tell you what happened in it.
Let's see.
All right. He breaks down, and he cries, and I'm embarrassed, and I take the camera off him, and then I realize, well, it's not my position to take the camera off him, and then I pan back, and I partly did that because I had done a film earlier with him called Lightning Over Water with Nick Ray. and Nick Ray is dying of cancer, and he's in pain, and he loses his lines, and he just looks at the camera, and I keep the camera on, and he finally goes, cut, and because he's also directing the film. And I didn't turn the camera off because I knew it was this, strong moment. And he goes, cut, cut, cut. And then I cut the camera off. And there were people that wrote about the film, and they felt that was cruel, that, we were exploiting Nick Ray. And that was in the back of my mind when this scene which I wish we could still look at, but me talking about it, it's better you see it. But anyway, where I panned back, and then, like I said, it was a long editing process to find out what this material was, what this film was. And Wim used the whole shot. And it creates an emotion in the shot, in the scene, because you feel kind of what I was talking about before, the filmmaker or the operator or whoever, you feel their connection to that material that allows the audience to feel that emotion. And that's what I was trying to say about we as filmmakers or image makers or cinematographers, we also introduce a certain emotion in the footage by how you operate. That images have a visual rhythm and there's a human behind the camera. And I mean, that brings up another point about like hand-hold work. Like today, many films use hand-hold work, but I feel they do it because they think it's emotional honesty of showing a performance in real time, and that somehow this is real because it's hand-hold. But I think that's just a device like any other device that you're exploiting to show an emotion for the characters that maybe aren't there. And if it's poor hand-hold work, I think it actually takes you out of the scene. But when you see very good hand-hold work, or you see where a camera does move in a rhythm and empathy with the subject matter, it strengthens the story. Like I was just looking at this footage, I haven't seen this in a long time, it's like when he walked out of the frame and then the camera pans down and looks at the camera, Wim wasn't there telling me, all right, this take, you're gonna pan down to the camera. That was something, even in a documentary, I'm trying to tell a story with a camera, and I'm thinking ahead of like, well, if he moves out of the frame, what am I gonna do, So I'm always kind of thinking even when I shot documentaries about where the camera might go. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong, But I would do that because you're part of especially in documentaries, you're part of the storytelling and how you operate the camera.
Any questions about what we saw? I noticed that in a lot of your films you use fixed frames, and I was wondering, after seeing what we saw just now, if you think this kind of filmmaking, like they did, can still exist today, and do you miss this kind of simplicity of making a film?
Well, it depends. Like when we did Mildred Pierce, the Todd Haynes recent, it was a TV 5-part series, he said we're going to use static frames. Well, the first shot was a dolly shot and it never stopped. It depends on the filmmaker. That's his, way he sees things and the feeling, and the intricacy of a moving camera. But here, we're mimicking, he said he used a 50mm lens. So what we did was we used a 25mm lens, which would be the same field of view as a 50mm in 16 versus 35. And of course, Ozu, like he said, shot with static frames. So of course, I tried to shoot with static frames. And it was just me and the tripod, no assistant, and Wim with the sound, so I couldn't be moving the camera around, but
also, after looking at the scene, you worked with so many different directors, so many different approaches to filmmaking, and I wanted to know what you think about this relationship between cameraman and director.
well, I mean, one part I thought I'd bring up is like how you interview with a director for a film. I mean, what's your approach, you know, as a cinematographer? Well, look, you get the script, you read the script, and obviously if they call you, you know, they're thinking about you. So I don't know if this has been to my success or not, but I usually go in with visual ideas. I take things out of books or magazines. I have a big, you know, book collection. I think about the film language of telling the story. And many times I've gone into interviews with ideas and the director looks at me like I'm half crazy, like, are you trying to do my job? And not all directors are visual. So some directors want your input that way to create the visual language. And other directors who I know are very strong visually, those are the directors I usually work with. Even if, you know, when you work with him, I know his language. When I work with Ulrich Seidl, I know his language. When I work with Todd, so I can implement what their vision is. It's the directors that are in between, that don't really have a visual style, and they're afraid of you imposing your style on it. So you have to find your language with them. And one way I do that is I break the script down with the director. I'll give you an example, like Todd Solondz, who I revere and became a very close friend with. When I looked at his other films, besides, well, the one film I did with him, Life During Wartime, I found his films very unvisual. And I know the cameraman he worked with on a few films, Fred Elms. And so I was a little hesitant to work with him. And I was supposed to do a film with another director, Miranda July, who's a performance artist. So I was very excited about to work with her. And but her film didn't go through at that time. And his producer called me, and I said, sure, I'll take a meeting with Todd. And then we hit it off famously. We're both from New Jersey, both suburban, Jewish, you know. So I understood his world, but I think he also realized he had to do more visually with his storytelling. And so I said, well, let's break the script down together. And so I can talk through a scene with a director visually, and I did that. And I could see sometimes he was hesitant, and I realized why. Because as a screenwriter, he didn't want the images to take over the story. He didn't want the images to be more than what he wrote on the page. And once I kind of showed him that I could reinforce the ideas that were written, that the images can be a metaphor, and that's to me what images are. They're a metaphor for your storytelling, you know. And so once he understood that I could reinforce what he was writing, he trusted me, and we had a really great relationship that way. But I think that it's trust, you know, as much as the director has to trust the cinematographer, I know on a subconscious level the director or photographer or cinematographer has to trust the director, because, you know, cinematographers to a large degree are very protective. And I can honestly say when I was younger, I always thought there was one way to do things because that's the way I figured them out. And as I grew in experience, I realized there was not one way of doing it. And in some ways, I find it more interesting now if a director does things totally opposite than the way I would do it, because then I have to come up with a solution. And honestly, I can tell you about Todd Haynes. He's very strong visually, but sometimes his approach of how to do things, it doesn't make sense. So I have to find ways, like I have to find ways to communicate with them so we're not at each other's throat. But it's funny, I sometimes I go into situations and I say, he's going to put the camera exactly the opposite of where I would put the camera. And sure enough, it happens. But we come up with a solution that's better than my idea or his idea. And I think that's why we still work with each other. I mean, because we have that dialogue. So you have to find what that dialogue is with the director and understand, you know, he's under a lot of pressure. Like I've directed, and I can say this honestly. When I'm a cinematographer, I come up with a solution to the problem. That's part of my job, and I'm sure about how I can implement the storytelling through the image. When I'm a director, I'm much more questioning, am I doing it the right way? Because I know there's many ways to do it. As a cinematographer, I feel like I have a day, you know, to shoot 4 scenes. I have this much time, I better come up with a solution. So I'm much more practical about what I'm doing than when I'm a director. I'm always questioning what I'm doing. And I don't do that as a cinematographer.
Okay, maybe we'll see another part of the film, The Limey.
Oh, all right. All right, I didn't know we were
Say
doing this. So,
something.
but all right, so The Limey is a film I did with Steven Soderbergh. And what's kind of interesting about this approach was, I think we did this after, maybe we did it before. I forget if we did it before or after Aaron Brockovich,
I
but
think it was before.
it was before, yeah. But he wanted to reference 70s hard-boiled film noir, you know, the ideas of film noir in the 70s. There were really 2 films that now escape my mind. What were they? The one in San Francisco with John Borman directed. It was, it's an important film. Anyway, I'll think of it.
Point blank.
What?
Point blank.
You got it. Point Blank, which was a very abstract, almost experimental film that John Borman did. And so that was and then a film that was shot in England. I know we're going to talk about it. Anyway, and the actor that we used was in that film, but when he was much younger.
Ken Loach film, okay.
Yeah, Ken Loach film, The Poor Cow. And the actor is Terrence Stamp. So it was interesting. He was experimenting with a lot of things in this film. He was also experimenting with time. And the way he played with time is really interesting. We would shoot a scene, and then a day later or 2 days later, he would say in a different scene to the actors, say the same lines that you said in scene XYZ 3 days ago. And then in the editing, he used the dialogue from the other scene over the other scene, if I'm explaining this. Or he would use the dialogue over the reaction shot. And what was happening was you started to enter this strange world of, like, again, like I say, which is hard to do in a film, is enter the interior world of the character. So, and we also shot this film never on a tripod. Maybe there are a few shots on a tripod, but primarily he wanted the camera to have a freedom, not necessarily hand-hold, but wherever you would put the camera isn't where you could put the camera on a tripod. So it might be on the bed, it might be on a chair. It was placed in places that you wouldn't normally place the camera. And this also created a certain kind of world, or, you know, also he was showing LA that you don't normally see. They were like real locations, sometimes lit, sometimes not. I don't know what scene what are you going to show?
I thought of showing the beginning of the film, because then you see
All
the
right.
language as the most.
All right.
So maybe we
All right,
can
we'll
see
look
the
at it
part
and then we
and
could
can
talk about it. Oh, interesting enough, there's a couple of things to discuss here. Like the shot in the car in the back seat, we lost the light. Actually, the generator went down, and the new stock, the 800 Kodak stock came out, and I had a roll of it. So I said, Stephen, what are we going to do? And then I said, oh, wait a minute, I have that 800 roll stock. I said, look, either it'll be the best shot in the film or we're going to have to reshoot it. And he said, let's do it. And that's the other thing about working with a director. The director has to give you the feeling they want to take chances with you. And cameramen are a lot of times protecting themselves so they don't get blamed for something. And I know, like in a studio situation, you have executives back at the studio going, well, you underexposed that, fire him. But if you have a strong enough director to say, no, we wanted to do it that way and try it that way. But, I can tell you honestly, I've been fired like 3 times. And once was because I got along too well with the director, and they didn't like that we were, doing things the way we wanted to do it, not the way the producer wanted to do it. And that was on Bad Santa. And, but anyway, so now today, you shoot digitally and, you could get an image like that. But back then, that was, what we did is we just drove by storefronts on 3rd Avenue in LA where I thought there was enough light, and it was just enough light, but it looks, I could never light it like that. That's also something about like working with ambient light, which, cameramen like Robbie Mueller and who else? John Alcott would work that way. That way at the time was, pretty revolutionary because, the Hollywood cameramen always want to use lights. And that was more from, what I learned from Europe, how you work with what's there. And like I say about ambient light, you can never get those color shifts and the timing, and it's the unexpectedness. And to me, that's part of the joy and fun about what we do is what's unexpected, what happens visually that happens in that moment in time and space. I know it's kind of like sculpting light in time. And Tarkovsky wrote a book about, filmmaking that way, sculpture in time. But cinematography can be that way. And today even more so, because in the digital world loves the underexposure, loves low light, that you can take great chances. The problem for me with the digital world is it all looks the same. It's kind of like, I like to think of it this way. Film is like an etching. Light creates the image through these 3 layers, your red, green, blue, RGB, and it etches the film. And also the grain is always changing from frame to frame. There's kind of a metamorphosis of the filmic image that's happening in life. Like in this book, he talks about film being close to life, what life is, because we operate on a certain level like that with light. We're affected by light, the way film is affected by light. And the digital world, as much as I can analyze it or try to talk to people about it, it's pixel fixed. In other words, your shadow and light and your colors are all on one film plane, so to speak. And for me, it lacks depth. It lacks color separation. Colors respond differently digitally than it does on film. And you don't have the grain movement that gives it a certain kind of, for me, human quality. Now, I know you're all younger than I am, and you're growing up looking at digital images. So for you, maybe it doesn't matter, but for someone like me or you, we grew up on filmic images, and film has a certain gravity, a certain weight for me that I lose digitally. And it's not to say that I don't think certain stories can't be told digitally, and it's the way the world is going. Like I love in documentaries how open we can be with digital work, because I don't think in documentaries you want to use the technical apparatus to come between you and the subject matter. And so a very lightweight digital camera, everyone has digital cameras, people don't take you as seriously, and so you can implement how you tell your stories wonderfully that way. Like I just saw, and I've been asking people here, people haven't seen it here, but I saw 5 broken cameras. This Palestinian made this film with this Israeli director in this border town. I don't know if they explained it to you, but they're building a wall through the town, or part of his, where he grows his olive trees. And he got a digital camera, this Palestinian cinematographer, filmmaker, to basically just record his son's, first years. But he became the videographer of the town, the village. I don't know the village, but what is it? Oh, all right. And as he's documenting his child, the military are coming to this town to implement, the law, and you see how the town is affected by it. He starts filming that confrontation, that situation, and it's very personal. And then he gets his camera broken, and then he goes back and filming his child's next year's birthday, and then he has a second child, and it's all told through this human story, through his children and through the story. Anyway, it's a wonderful film, and I all hope you get to see it. And but it's very crude the way he shoots, but there's something so honest and true and digital, because that's what he had to shoot with, that's another example of how the digital world works, because we can put it in everybody's hand to tell our stories.
Talking about digital images, life during wartime, your collaboration with
yeah, so that was the first time I really shot. Well, that was the second time I shot, but with a red. It was an early red, and I was never really happy with what I had to do to get the results out of it. And I know they've improved it, but
was it an artistic decision to go with the red, or?
Well, like I said, I came on to the film very late, and it was a cost factor. And also for Todd Solondz, it was very good because he shoots very long takes, and he shoots many takes, and they never could afford the amount of film to shoot on film. But I have to say, I really think it's a false economy to say that the digital world is cheaper than the film world, because you tend to shoot more material, so then it costs you more money to transfer. I know on a certain low budget level, yes, digital world is cheaper, but when you get into like shooting a Hollywood film or a film with a better budget, I still don't believe that it's more cost effective. I mean, I think the marriage between film and digital, the DI is, but it's a lost argument. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I think one day, the way records came back, it will be a small percentage, but people will, hopefully there'll still be a lab to process the film, but people will realize and say, God, film had a different look, and, there'll be people that still want to shoot in film, but we as cinematographers, I don't know. I think you have to learn both things. I know it's hard because it's expensive, but just even with a still camera to understand exposure and how you manipulate the image certainly helps even in the digital world. But we'll look at, the early red, everything would go very magenta, so I had to plus it with a lot of yellow, which worked in this film because it's supposedly Florida, southern Florida, so I could have that kind of hot look. I don't know, what part are you going to show?
It's the part that where she walks at night when she starts walking. at
Oh,
night.
all right. So it was kind of a dream sequence. And then let it play in the restaurant, because that's. So, all right, that's an early red, but, everybody worries about the highlights, but the shadow detail blocks up. In film, you would read detail in the shadow area, where here you lose that detail. So, the thing about the digital world, at least at that time, was, sure, it's like shooting film about 30 years ago. It doesn't have the exposure latitude of film, but I know the Alexis, and I haven't shot with it, has, they claim 12 to 14 stop difference, but I have to play with it myself to see if that's true or not. But anyway, and what else? Oh, I'll give you another point looking at this. That restaurant was a closed restaurant, but when we went in there for the, 2 days before, because this was very low budget, they had stuff all over the walls. So I went to Todd and I said, look, we got to stylize this place. It's an abstraction, it's all right. It's real, but it's not real. We got to take everything out, And then I just left things that were white, red, and black, like the sign, so that was a construction that I did with the art director. And then we fought all right, we had the tablecloths. They made the tablecloth the same as her outfit, the maitre d' or whatever. But like the red and the white line on the wood, the borders, that was like a big fight to pay to get that made. But so it's those kind of things that, as cinematographers, you have to have a vision, to understand what you're putting in front of the camera, how it's going to create a world and design, and I don't know if that's more my painting background, but I always think of what the whole world is going to kind of look like. And many times I take things out of the set because I find the sets are too busy. And I like to take them out so what you see has a strength of what you're looking at. And a lot of times I even in the frame balance things. I move things around in the frame so they're not cutting into their head or growing out of their head. And I just remember that looking at this, that that was a big deal about how we would go into that empty space, that restaurant, and create it not necessarily it was a Good Fridays or something, but that we made it our own world. And I think that's something you can always do, is create your own world in the imagery of what you're creating. Are there any questions on that one?
Yeah, about this film, I actually remember it to be one of the prettiest films I've seen, and in this scene, and I remember the light pouring like milk when she walks in that top shot. And I wanted to ask, didn't you find upsides to the red? Because to me it looked better than other films at the time.
I can say I did a lot of work in the post. At night, the digital world, be it red or it likes low light. It's hard when you're in day exterior. It doesn't have the contrast range. Now, again, I can't say this because I haven't seen the Alexis or worked with the Alexis. and I've seen film shot with the Alexis. It's just, you know what I did on certain day scenes, which we haven't seen in here, is I would do like 3 or 4 passes. So the lab was kind of experimenting with me. It would be a very expensive process to do, but I'll explain you what I did. Was I would do 1 pass for the shadow detail. Then I do another pass for the mid-range. Then I do another pass for the highlights. So in other words, I would have the colorist time the same shot 3 or 4 different times for different levels of exposure, and then we put them all together. Because I always thought you could do that in a still. I always wanted to try that in a still to extend the exposure range of a shot to do different, you could go for the under, bring out the shadow detail, the highlights. And so I did that in day scenes here, but that would be prohibitively expensive because you have to pay 4 times the time for the timing of each shot. Then they have to put them together. And they were experimenting if they could figure out a technique to do that. Now, like I say, the Alexis extends the exposure latitude, so you maybe don't have to do that.
You'd shoot that 3 times?
No, let's say there's one shot that I shot, whatever my exposure was. Then I said, looking at that shot, the shadow detail, I like to see more in the green, something in the part of the frame is too dark because the exposure latitude, it's there in the raw files, right? But it's not there when they do 1 pass, because they just do an exposure adjustment for the average. So what I was telling the colorist to do is, isn't there a way that, because it's the same shot, couldn't we do it 3 or 4 times and I can go in and manipulate the shadow detail, the highlights, the mid-range? He goes, well, let's see. And they did it because then they have to track the person walking, because then the secret is they have to put the 4 different exposures together, how that affects the image.
And you did that all through the film?
No, I did it in certain shots. I could show you, there's one shot at a pond where I pan around the pond, and then the little boy walks up to you walks up to the camera with a flower, and it was sunny, so the shadow detail I kind of lost. So we did 1 pass for the shadow detail of the foliage around the lake. Then I did 1 pass for the highlights and 1 for the mid-range. So it could be done, but it's like a BiPAC.
And in the rest of the film, what was the post that you said that improved the? You said it looked so nice because of a lot of post-production.
You post and let's say this. I used to shoot reversal film where you had more. I understood that at this point in time with the red, I didn't have the exposure latitude that I thought I would in film. So I had to work with a more limited palette. So I was just very careful about how I exposed the negative or the digital file. I had to be more careful than I would on film to get the same results. And I had to spend double the time in post to get the same look. Now maybe today it's different, but
you can use this now with the Epic, with the Red Epic. You have this.
yeah,
HDR
probably
technique
you have a greater range, and I'm always surprised when I shoot digitally in stills how much you have to play with. But you're shooting at a higher. This is what 3.2. What is it? Gigs. What is it? DPI or I don't know all this stuff. It wasn't 5 gigabytes. It's not gigabytes. What is it?
What, the screen or the?
Well, it's 4. What?
4K.
4K. Yeah. So it was really 3.2. They lie. They always say it's 4, but it's 4. So now you're shooting at 5, right?
Yeah.
the Alexis is what, 5?
No, the Epic is 5, but what I wanted to say about the Epic, they have exactly the technique that now that you did in post, you can do it on the camera when you're shooting. It's called HDR, and you can have 3 different.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
same,
Yeah,
So
that's the way they do it now.
Yeah,
Extend the
before you
range
time.
of the negative or the digital file. They figured out that's the way they did it. Right. So I did it in a primitive way that they built into the camera. Soon we will need cameramen, you know. Well, they don't think we need cameramen anyway, you know. Anybody can shoot now and whatever.
The next film I wanted to show is Import-Export.
All right, so maybe the beginning of that. So this is the, or
Okay.
what
I
part?
wanted to ask that you worked with a lot of European directors. One of them is Ulrich Seidl.
Yeah, Ulrich Seidl. This is a director that I really like. I think he's doing something different than many people. He works with actors and non-actors, but it's the way he develops a story that's so interesting. He has an idea for a story that he researches, and this story was the title Import-Export. It's about a girl that comes from the East to Vienna to have a better life, and her friends have to work in prostitution, but even that was interesting because when he first wrote the script, it was just a girl that's a prostitute in Kiev. And then when he started to research the story, he realized what was happening was it wasn't so much women on the street, but now what had become prevalent was internet sex. So he spent like over a year getting permission to shoot in a real internet sex apartment in which you go to like an office building, and then you go in this office, and there's stations, different women in different rooms that on their computer are relating to whoever's calling them what to do. And that was like, whoa. So we use our actress. I don't know, we're showing that sequence? I guess not. Maybe they'll want to see that sequence. But anyway, they go in the rooms and we take our actress. So we had a girl that was kind of an actress, but is our actress in the film, into a real one of these internet sex parlors, and then we put her girlfriend in the storyline in this. But what I wanted to say, how he develops a story is, so he has an idea for a story, you know. So it was about this girl coming from the East to the West, and then it's about this kind of delinquent kid living with his mother and his stepfather who end up in the East because they're like selling like, you know, vending machines. And the stepfather is this kind of brute, and he's, you know, he just wants to go to the, you know, there and have fun and, you know, meet girls and get drunk, you know. And the boy who you think would be the brute is the sensitive one. And so you see how the East and the West don't connect with each other. They each have different expectations of what the other is. You know, the girl in the East wanting a better life, and the people in the West thinking they're going to take advantage of what they do, taking advantage of the, you know, the East, but also, you know, the economy, you know, the breakdown in the economy from communism to capitalism. So anyway, the incredible thing is what Ulrich does is we shoot in real situations. We put the actors in situations with real people, and he stylizes it to a degree, but at a certain point the stylization breaks down and you're in this real world. And I kind of did this with Werner Herzog with a film called Stroszek, where we had actors and then they come to America, there's kind of these misfits, and we put them in real situations with real people in real locations, and people didn't know what we were doing. They thought we were from a newspaper. You know, we'd be in cafes and bars with our actors relating to real people, and But anyway, I don't know what we're going to look at. What are you going to look at?
You want to see the beginning, or?
Well, that just kind of shows you the setting of. Maybe we could see that and then push into.
Okay, I thought the part where she becomes a nurse and then she comes to the.
All right,
old
so
people,
we
because it really
shot.
makes
He
the
got
part-
permission to shoot in a real retirement center that's run by the state, and these people had given up everything and were basically dying in this facility, and we put our actress, who's a nurse in the film. Well, she ends up being a nurse, or she actually was a nurse in the Ukraine, and then she ends up at this retirement center, and it's very sad because we're using the real people, but it's very heartening the way these people are able to like be themselves, and at least we gave them the attention. Anyway.
Maybe we'll see it in a minute.
Yeah, it was all right. Well,
I just wanted to ask about this film. Like you said before, it mixes fiction and documentary, and I think in some way it somehow stretches the boundaries from where the camera is allowed to invade and not allowed. And I think it's something you can also see in your career. We see Ken Park, where the camera is a lot of time invading. And I wanted to ask for you, where do you draw the line? What do you think we should show and what we can't show?
well, obviously, I believe you can show anything. It's the context that you show it. In the sense of Ken Park, this film I did with Larry Clark, it's very explicit sexually, but it's about abuse. And I always say that the sexuality in the film isn't to titillate or it isn't vivacious or it's lustful. If anything, it's showing how the children are abused by the parents, and that's it actually inverts with the way you think, because it's the mother of one of the children who seduces a young boy. You know, boy, he's still a teenager. And you know, the point is, and this is something, you know, it has a lot to do with Larry Clark's work, where he pushes the boundary. And you know, there are things in the film that, in cutting, I would have cut a little differently. But I understand that the point is, if there's an emotional honesty of how you're trying to reach an audience, cutting away to me is just as wrong as showing it. I think it's the context that you show it in. And in this situation, you know, obviously it was strange that we went to like the heaviest two of the heaviest scenes. I mean, there's a lot of scenes that are very heavy in this film. These people are left to die there, and in this facility, and I know this happens, you know, it's happened in the United States and many places. I don't know if it's happened in Israel, but in this hospital, like 2 or 3 years before, there was a nurse that was killing the patients, and so so these people were. It was also to bring attention to what was happening to these people, and it's hard to see it out of context to the rest of the story. But she befriends someone that's a gentleman that offers to marry her. And so we wanted to show the relationship she has with these older people, that she finds some compassion with these people that she doesn't find with the rest of the Austrians that she comes in contact with. So we wanted to say something about that, or I think that's what he was getting at. And this scene in the beginning with this child, of course, that's always a scene that's, you know, grabs people. but that's the way those that water in the tub was snow that they bring in from the outside. That's a real hospital outside of Donetsk where they don't even have running water. And so to show the conditions, I mean, yes, if you show it in a documentary, you're showing a narrative. You know, that it's always a question about with Ulrich, you know, is he crossing the line because is he exploiting these people? But I always feel like he's making films about these people for these people. He's not making fun of these people. He's with those people. And I don't think he's doing it on a voyeuristic level. I always say that he's moral without being moralistic. Anyway, I did a long interview that's actually on this film about more about Ulrich's style of how he mixes reality and fiction. And I think, you know, like Godard said that, you know, you find fiction in reality and reality in fiction. And I think that's what Ulrich is doing. You know, and maybe it's hard for people because they go like, you know, is it all right to show it in a narrative sense, but not all right to show it in a in some kind of reality, you know, or this just makes us uncomfortable. I think what Ulrich is basically doing is holding a mirror up to the audience, and you know, the things that we don't want to see about ourselves, and I think that's all right.
Okay, so we'll end up with your film that
Oh.
you directed.
First day. Wait, what scene out of this one? Oh yeah, the scene with the mother. That would be good.
Yeah, you want the scene with
Yeah,
the
I think that shows, but show it from the beginning
From
when
the
he comes
beginning.
in with a skateboard.
Okay.
All right. All right. So, all the children or the boys, they were over 18. They were over 18, but they were all non-actors. And she's an actress, a well-known soap opera star. So this was a big challenge for her to do this part. But she was, she really wanted to show that she could act in a serious film. And you know, I really feel that we caught the real emotions between these characters, even though it was a scripted story. We let them improvise some of the dialogue from the given dialogue. And here's a situation where I was the director, one of the directors, so I used the camera the way I really love to, is where I'm interacting with the action while it's happening. Like, I never knew I would go pan over to their hands at that moment, but I saw out of my eye what was happening, and I was feeling the moment, and that's what I was saying when the photography or the cameraman or the cinematography is one with the image. You're in that moment, and I go over and they have that moment in their hands, and then it breaks, you know. She says, "Oh, can you give me my hairbrush?" And then even that choice that I go over to him after he brushes her hair, and she takes the brush away from him, which is kind of a rejection, and then he's left kind of confused. So those are all ways that the camera can implement the story, but that has a certain kind of emotion. And that's what I was saying, you don't always do that just because it's hand hold. You can do that on a tripod if you have a good assistant and if you're in tune with what's happening. And that's the way I shot the whole film, and that's anyway.
And this film is a collaboration with Larry Clark.
Yeah, Larry
Yes.
Clark is probably Robert Frank and Larry Clark are the two photographers why I became interested in photography, because they were, Robert Frank did this seminal book called The Americans, and Larry did a book called Tulsa and Teenage Lust. Larry, this I co-directed, was an amphetamine addict and went to prison, and he was a bad guy. And but what he did do is his mother was a baby photographer, and he would go with his friends after school with a camera, and he documented his friends who were into drugs and petty gangsters or whatever. And he documented this world, and it was very revolutionary at the time that someone within a world captured the world so personally. It wasn't somebody from the outside. You feel his images are very connected to the person photographing the images, that there's an access and accessibility to the image that's quite remarkable. And then in the case of Robert Frank, here's a Jewish Swiss immigrant, comes to America and sees America in the 50s when everybody had great optimism of what America represented through, a commercialized viewpoint, kind of like Far From Heaven, if we think of it. These images that people really can't live up to. And he captured, an America that nobody wanted to see in a very poetic way. His images have this great, wonderful metaphor for America. If you've seen, or you should look at his work. Like he used the American flag in many images, and just kind of, how can I say? Archetypal kind of imagery that, cars, and anyway, he captured an America that nobody had ever really looked at, and he was criticized for it. And he also did it in a very raw way, where exposure was off and it was grainy and sometimes out of focus. He was even criticized for being a bad photographer. He was way ahead of his time. Now we would think of it like almost like punk photography. Now it would be contemporary, but he was about 30 years and still keeps ahead. Now he makes films. He's 84. I was just with him last weekend, and he's still working. He still carries a camera with him and shoots whenever he feels it. But anyway, so the style of this film, Ken Park, I wanted to shoot it in a way, like I say, I didn't want to ghettoize it and shoot it in a rough documentary way. I wanted to shoot it kind of almost the way you see TV commercials in America, in which there's a certain homogeny, cosmetic look to the world, but you're not allowed to see what's really happening. It's kind of like what you don't see behind closed doors. And that's if you know Larry's first film that he did was Kids. That was a look at the kids in a world. And this film, we say, was a look at the parents through the children. Because when the structure of the film is about a skate park, and we meet different kids along the way through the skate park. So it's not one narrative, but collectively we're trying to show something about how these young teenagers kind of form their own family they really parent the parents, and how the parents don't have the tools, and because of their own insecurities and frustrations in life, pass off their problems, pass off their immaturity onto their children. And in her case, where she cries or slightly cries, and we cut to the pictures of her as a cheerleader, here's a woman that had children when she was probably got pregnant in high school, and so she never feels like she really developed all the ways that she wanted to, and she married the jock, and now he's kind of an overweight Duff, and so you know she's using this boy, you know, for her own, you know, emotional, you know, inadequacy. So anyway, it's hard to show just clips and try to explain the whole film, but that was kind of the methodology or the idea behind this film, Ken Park. It was, my reason for doing it was I wanted to document something about Larry Clark's life. And I met him in Graz, Austria at an art fair. And I said, hey man, have you ever made a film? And he goes, no, how do you make a film? Because he's only been known as a still photographer. And I said, oh, it's easy, we'll just hang out together, I'll show you. And he goes, well, I'm into kids in the skate park. You know, I'm into skaters, because he's always looking for a way into, he's never really left, I could say this, his adolescence. He's always, his world is always about these kids in different aspects. And I think it has to do a lot to do with dealing with his own childhood. And so I said, yeah, well, that's great. I used to be a skater. So we used that device, but really I wanted to document something about Larry's world. And then I found out, I said to Larry, you know, you have a visual diary of these, of your world. Did you ever keep a written diary when you were growing up? And he said, yeah. And I go, well, let me see it. So he showed me his diary, but neither of us are writers. And then he had met Harmony Korine. Harmony wrote this script. And I knew Harmony. He was a PA on Light Sleeper. So we got together when we say, look, you know, we're both in our 50s at this point. We really should give it to someone young, and this is great about Larry, that he's so open. Give him the material and let's see what he comes up with. So we gave him his diaries, and all these stories that come out of his diary are somehow used in the film. So these are all actually based on real situations. And then we, you know, made this narrative. And we could never get money in the States. I mean, you know, people didn't know who Larry Clark was and barely knew who I was. And we got money out of Europe. But they never thought we were going to shoot the film the way we shot the film. You know, that it would be this open. And then, you know, they thought they'd never be able to show it. And then it went to Venice, and it got very interesting reviews. And then it went to other festivals. And then it got released all over the world. It was like in the top 10 films in France and Germany. But I've never been able to show it in the United States. It was under Bush at the time, and we would have gotten locked up. And, there's some really weird laws in the United States. You can't even if they think you're impersonating a child under 18 in a sexual encounter, you can be arrested, even in animation. So anyway, you know, so I just say, the point about this film too is that there's a way of looking at sexuality in a nurturing and positive way, in a way that's beneficial, and that's what we try to show between the kids. You see a later scene with them together, and you see how nurturing the sexuality is emotionally, and how the parents, again, like I say, are imposing their own limitations on the children for their needs and not seeing what they're doing to the children. So is that enough for today?
Do we have any final questions?
About Ken Park, I'm curious to know if Larry Clark was part of like shooting script, all that, because he got this strong visual background.
You know, in the credits we said we would share everything. All right. So he did second camera in a few scenes where there's multiple people in the scene, but primarily I did all the lighting and I shot it. But that's the way we set it up. So he worked with the kids and I worked with the parents. In the scenes that were just kids, he has a great rapport with the kids, and they had great trust, and so we let that be. And we would discuss things before, and it worked out very well. The editing was difficult because it was his editor, so there were things I wanted to change a little sometimes, and the editor always felt beholden to Larry, so it was always kind of tricky, but it worked out. I mean,
עוד שאלות? Some more questions?
did that film get shown here?
I don't think, in
No.
the cinema, no. It's
Oh.
on DVD.
But I think in Cinematex.
It's what?
I think in the Cinematex, not commercial.
Oh. Yeah, it's the most downloaded film on the internet. I haven't seen a penny of it, but whatever. I got to make the film the way I wanted.
So I think so just a taste.
Yeah, I hope we have something else to talk about.
What?
I'm kidding. I said I hope there's something else to talk about after today. No, but I brought a few other films, but I didn't know we were going to see these. But great.
Maybe Thursday.
In the
Yeah.
coming days, Thursday especially.
Or maybe I could see some of your films on the screen and we could talk about it. Maybe that. It's one thing to be in the field and we shoot together and we could talk, but it also helps me to see your work, and then we could talk about it, and you could tell me what you were thinking about and your choices, and then I can tell you how I respond to it, because our storytelling and images are only completed with an audience. The interesting thing for me is whenever I've done things kind of like privately in my own head, like what I'm going to do, I'm always amazed. That's the thing that someone will come up to me and say, "Oh, I really liked," or it was really interesting. They always see that. I always find that really interesting. That the thing that you kind of challenge yourself on, or have your own little dialogue, is the thing that reaches people. So it's interesting to see. That's why I kind of like doing this. And a few times I've done this because, well, you've all been very shy, but once you get to know me, you won't have to be so shy. You can actually express yourself what you think or like or don't like or question, because that's what we're here for, is to have a dialogue.
I think we focused more on showing your things.
All right.
And it was just a taste.
But I mean, they can have an opinion.
Yeah, sure. We had a lot to see, that's the problem.
I mean, maybe you could show, how many are cinematographers? Maybe you could raise your hand.
Not many.
Oh, not many. Oh.
But because
And-
they are
and-
now some of them are preparing the set for tomorrow.
Oh, I see. And then the others are directors or script writers? How many are directors?
They study everything.
Script writers? What
They study everything.
they study everything. All right.
Potentially the other way.
Oh, potentially.
To be challenged.
All right. Very good. Well, you can all teach me the digital cameras.
Okay, I would like to thank
All right,
you very
well,
much.
thank you.
Thank you.